On my 21st birthday, at that point in my life, my alcoholism was already in full swing. My life orbited alcohol. The point of Sunday mornings was to figure out how I could convince people to drink with me that night. That's how insidious it was, and it kind of had my whole worldview wrapped up in it. On my 21st birthday, my twin brother and I, we went out, we drank too much. We got into a physical altercation. I crossed a line where I hurt my brother really bad. I woke up the next morning and I remember limping to the mirror and looking in the mirror through two black eyes. And it was almost like everything that had been on the inside of me was brought to the outside. You guys ever experienced that where I got to see like who I was, and really not so much who I was or called to be, but where I was living, and I looked at myself and I was appalled. Now, I want you to know that at that point in my life, I believed that my value came from what I had to offer. And so it was, I'm going to be successful in the eyes of the world. And even during my addiction, I kind of packaged it well enough together that the world would look at me and say, hey, that guy is winning. Like they would look at me and say, that guy has a lot to offer, except in that moment where God, in his grace and generosity, allowed me to step into a place where I looked in the mirror and I saw where I was. And I looked in the mirror and I realized that I wasn't enough. And this idea of being enough for God, because I had this mentality, if I could just put my LinkedIn profile together in such a way that God looked at me through that, then maybe I could woo this God of the universe into wanting to hang out with me. You guys ever do that? And yet I looked in the mirror and I saw that I had nothing to bring to him. And yet at the same time, it started this wooing process where I didn't earn his favor, but he said, no, like, I want you to be a son. Like, I want to call you into my family. It wasn't because of what I did. It's who he created me to be, and he started working me back into the image that I was supposed to step in, that there was a process, and I needed to realize first that I didn't have it all together. It's looking at myself through two black eyes that I began to realize that I wasn't the one bringing the most to the table, that it was God doing the work, and he was stepping into my mess. But something happens to us, or at least it happened to me, when we come into the presence of God. And we realize, no, like I need him, like I'm desperate, I need him. And we come into the presence of God, and then we start feeling like we need to act like we've still got it together. You guys ever feel that? Where you're like, no, I can't walk to him with a limp anymore. Like I can't just come to him as I am, broken and a mess and desperate. I need to package myself in a way that looks okay to the world. Why? Because if I believe what I believe, then how could I possibly feel the way that I feel? Like if I believe that he's king of the universe and savior of my life and soul, then how could I, in this moment, be in the valley? How could I be so alone? And what I want us to realize today is as we are invited into fellowship with the creator of the universe, he wants us to walk to him with a limp. Like he wants us to, not because he wants us to walk impaired, but because he wants us to realize our desperate need for the saving grace of God. If you've got your Bibles, I want to invite you to open up to Matthew chapter 14, and as you get there, if you are able to, you can go ahead and tag John 6. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be living in the same story, but from two different perspectives. We're going to be jumping into the perspective of John and also the perspective of Matthew as we can kind of unpack some of the details that each of them kind of bring forward in this story. And as you get there, I'm Josh. I'm the lead pastor of 180 Life Church, and we have been in a series called Immeasurably More. And that's a series that's tied to our campaign of raising funds for a building, and yet at the same time altogether separate, because ours is a God of immeasurably more. We know that he is more than we could ask, more than we could hope, more than we can imagine, and anytime we try to put him inside of a box, we're just waiting for that cage to break, because he is a God who cannot be contained. When we pick up in this verse, and I actually spoke to it last week because I jumped ahead to the end of the story where Jesus walked on water, and you might be like, Josh, why are you doing this out of order? Well, Christopher Nolan does it all the time, so it's fine. And so we're going to kind of jump back, and where Jesus is in this moment, I shared this last week, but he just found out that John the Baptist had been beheaded by Herod, and so he's in this time of mourning. Like Jesus has this amazing ability where he's so caught up in eternity, and yet he can be fully where he is. And so he's mourning, and he's ready to kind of sneak away to the mountain. It says he wants to get alone with his dad to pray, and that's where we pick up in verse 1. It says, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. And I love this because Jesus is in the midst of it. Like he's in the midst of mourning. And in that moment, a crowd shows up because that's just kind of what people do when they see what Jesus did. And that crowd is formed, and Jesus' response wasn't, "You're in my way." Like it wasn't like, "Hey, dude, like I've got things to do." His response was love. See, his default setting is compassion. And so when he looks at you and what you bring and where you are, he doesn't see you as an obstacle. He lives a life that is interruptible. We see in the Gospels over 30 times, Jesus has a path that he is walking, and over 30 times it is interrupted. And every single time he stops. And he's with the people around him in the way that they need him to. Why? To share truth, to call them to something better. And then he continues his marching forward. Jesus lived a life that was interruptible. And here's why that's important. Because if we've got this idea that we need to play church, that we need to not walk to Jesus with a limp, that we need to have a normal gait, that we need to act like everything is fine in the midst of the difficult and the hard, we are getting very confused on why Jesus came. Look at what he does. He has a response that is love, and then he heals the sick. As they limp to him, he is there and present with them. But how many of us have been a part of a church where nobody struggles ever? You guys ever do that? Except everybody is. Or like a part of a church where there are no marriages that are struggling and their kids always listen except they never do. And we play church and we dress it up and we act like it's the part. And Jesus says, no, I want you to limp. Not for the sake of the limp, but so you can understand your need. He invites us into his presence fully and wholly as we are. He wants us to step in. And here's the struggle, is because ours is a God of immeasurably more. And so we see how big he is, and we see in comparison how small we are, and we're like, oh no, I can't bring that to him. Like that's just the details. And yet ours is a God who's willing to step into the details. That's one of the ways that God shows me the most love is when he just I'm like, God, you did that. Like that was so small. Like you didn't need to do that. You didn't need to bring that up. You didn't need to change that in my life. You didn't need to say that. And yet God brings up the details. He did that in my quiet time this morning where I was listening to a song and the passage that I was reading this morning aligned perfectly with the song. And I was like, man, like you didn't need to do that. Like, and yet he steps into the details and says, no, I want you to know that I'm here and I'm present and I love you. In other words, and I've said it a bunch of times already, but we need to come to Jesus with a limp. He doesn't want us to dress it up and he doesn't want us to act like it's fine. That whole idea of fake it till you make it, that's not biblical. Like, some things we do need to tough out. I'm not saying you should just whine and complain about everything. I'm just saying that like when we're bleeding and when we're hurt, he says, hey, bring it to me. Those who are weary and burdened, he says, come to me and I will give you rest. Jesus says, you don't need to fake it. You just need to step into my presence and I will be near through the good and the difficult. See, Jesus, what he wants is he wants all of you. Like every bit of you, not 2/3, not most of you, not just everything, but that one thing that you don't like to talk about or think about. He says, I want all of you. And that's significant because nobody wants all of you. Nobody wants every piece of you. And some of you, like newly married, you're leaning over, I want all of you. You, sweetie. Well, just wait. Nobody wants all of you. I want you to think about it. Like there are thoughts in your head that if you shared with your spouse, you would freak them out. There are things that I do that drives my wife bananas. She's like, Jesus, if you could just work this out of my husband. If he could just put the cups from his nightstand. I've got a collection there. It's embarrassing. We'll get to it. Like nobody wants all of you, and yet he does. Like he wants every bit of you and more than you even know because all you know is some of where you've been and what you are doing now. And he knows every bit of it. And not just that, but he knows what you're going to do tomorrow. And he says, hey, I put myself up on a cross and he knew what he was paying for up there. He knew what you were going to do. He knew where you were going to go. He knew how bad your limp would become. He knew those desperate situations that you would lead into, not because of circumstance, but because of your own foolishness. And all the while, he says, I choose you. I put a gift in front of you if only you would accept it. Jesus says, I want all of you. In other words, stop hiding the limp. Like it's okay to limp. That's why we've got life groups, that we can limp together and bear each other up in a way that we could limp to the feet of Jesus, knowing that he is a God that is known as great physician, that he wants us to. Why? Because he didn't come for the healed. He came for the sick. That we could be in his presence and could be among him. Verse 15. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves food." I love this. So the crowd limps over to Jesus. They're like, "We're sick. We need healed. We need help." And the disciples who have it all together, right? Like they fully know what it looks like to just kind of check all the boxes on their LinkedIn profile. They've got the Instagram highlight reel going. And so they're like, "Hey, we got a plan. Jesus, clearly you don't know. This is a remote place. No McDonald's around here. This is West Hartford. They don't even do drive-thrus." They're like, "Jesus, clearly you don't know," but they need to go. You send them out because we've got a plan. Like we know what's good for them, and we've got an idea of what you should do. You ever do that where you start telling Jesus your plan as though it's his plan? Like, "Hey, Jesus, here's what you need to do." You might not have done it like the disciples where you're like, "Hey, there's a remote place. You should send them out, Jesus." But maybe you did it like this. "Hey, Jesus, I will have joy, peace, hope, and love. I'll have all the things if you give me that job. If you give me that car, I will be far more content than you could ever imagine. Like, God, if you give me that relationship, if you give me that thing or that object, then I'll be okay. I'll finally have hope, peace, and joy. Give me that baby, and I will have peace, Lord." Listen, you sure about that? See, every time we try to fill something in its place, it ends up hollow and wanting. Think marriage is the solution to your problems? Marriage doesn't get rid of your baggage, it just doubles it. If you're lucky. Like, it's not the solution. Like, and hear me, marriage is good. Like, you guys are like, "Man, you and Jenny are not okay." No, marriage is good and beautiful and holy and meant to be this wonderful picture of the gospel, and yet it's not the solution to your problem. You want to know why your spouse is never going to sustain you? Because they weren't meant to. Actually, that's one of the problems that we get into is we think that marriage is the solution to our problem. And so when we get married and they stop bringing us the happiness that they're supposed to bring us in our own minds, that's when we're like, "All right, I need to start making an exit plan." And yet, they're not meant to sustain you. You kids, they're not meant to sustain you either. You want to know why? Here's something that I try not to think about. Someday, they're going to leave you. That's just the reality. That's God's design. It's like someday, they're going to be sent from your home as disciples. And then what? They're not meant to sustain you. They're meant to point to someone who is. They're meant to say who is supposed to do that, but they're not going to be the ones that hold all things together for you. In other words, like getting to Jesus with a limp is great, but we also got to realize why we're going to him. It's not for the things. It's not for the stuff. It's for his presence. Even if you continue your limping days, you hear Paul talk about it. He says, "I got a thorn in my side that I've asked." He's like, "I've asked 3 times for him to take it away, and still it's right there in my side. Like, I can't get rid of it." And he's still God is good. Still, he is worthy of my pursuit. Why? Because it wasn't about getting rid of the thorn. It wasn't about getting rid of the limp. It wasn't about getting the things. It wasn't about getting married. He's like, no, it's about him. That's why I'm going to go to the creator of the universe. I'm going to go seek his presence because it's better. Jesus replied, man, this guy's got so much grace. He goes, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." I love that because he already knows what's happening. The other gospel talks about how like he was testing them. And like he's like, "You do it. Like I have a plan. Like you should have asked me what my plan is, but now, since you're so smart, you do it." And this is actually really a beautiful picture of what Jesus does. We're going to actually see it even further along in this story where Jesus didn't just do the things. Like he doesn't just perform the miracle. That's what this whole building campaign is about. It's not just that he performs the miracle, he invites us to take part in it. That we can take part in the mission of what he is doing as he takes kingdom ground, even with our limp. John 6, we're switching gospels here, buckle up. John 6, verse 7. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Exclamation mark. He's like, "God, like, are you have you lost it? He's like, well, this is a remote place. Not only that, but we don't have enough money to pull that up. Like, we couldn't possibly do this on our own. And this is where it hasn't clicked yet. It hasn't clicked that ours is a God of immeasurably more. It hasn't clicked for the disciples, hasn't clicked for Philip, and sometimes it doesn't click for us. That ours is a God who has it all figured out, that he stands outside of time and yet visits us in time, that we can be with him in his presence, but he knows every part of the story. Like, he knows everything that he is doing and what he has done and will continue to do, and that we are invited to take part in it. Ours is a God of immeasurably more. I had to ask a similar question. Like, God, like how are we going to pull this off? I was looking for buildings in West Hartford, and if you've ever done that, there aren't any. Right? Like, y'all built this place out 100 years ago. Like, this place is jam-packed. It's a bunch of, like, just a can of sardines, and at the same time, we found a building, and by found a building, I mean the building found us. Like, Jesus brought it to us in a way that we didn't even know it was on the market. You want to know why we didn't know? Because it wasn't. And yet he said, no, you didn't know about this, but I've got a plan that 19 years ago you didn't know, but I set in motion when I built this church. Not that you could have a building, but that you could have a stronghold in this community that can flip this place upside down. Verse 8. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. I love that Andrew in this was like, hey, Jesus, not only is there 5 pieces of bread and 2 fish, not only that, but they're small. He's like, I'm going to tell you twice. Like, there's 5 small pieces of bread, and he's like, there's 2 small fish. He's like, there's no way we could pull this out, as if the bread was large enough it could pull off this task. It's 5,000 men. Now, I want you to know that that's not including women, and that's not including children. And listen to how this works. It says that Andrew found a boy with 5 bread and 2 loaves. See, the solution to the problem that Jesus found was in a boy that wasn't even included in the head count. Because what Jesus does in these moments is he takes the ones who are counted out and he counts them in full. He says, hey, come to me with your limp. Like, come to me with your brokenness. I don't care how the world perceives you right now. I don't care how silly it looks in this moment. I don't care how dark that sin was. You think that stops his grace? It can't if only we bring it. He says, limp to me. Wherever you are, whatever you are in, I can turn it around. And I love this. There was a teacher that mentioned this. I don't know if it's true. I'm just going to step away from my Bible, but it's cool to think about. The question is, who do you think packed his lunch? Moms, even this, not just moms pack lunches, but I'll hear about that later. Moms, like, even the smallest things you do to shepherd and care for your family can have a kingdom impact that lasts for creates a legacy. Like, as we shepherd the hearts of our kids, it's meant to flip this world upside down. Like, listen, Jesus works through the young over and over again, and we're meant to raise them up, not as godly kids, but as godly men and women who are going to take this kingdom by storm. They're going to take kingdom ground wherever they go. And in New England, there's lots of ground to be taken. Jesus counts those that are counted out. Counts those with a limp. He says, I'm going to take your situation, I'm going to take where you are, and I'm going to transform it if you'll allow me to do so. And here's the whole point of all that. It's because too often we see our limp and we see the things that we're struggling with and we count ourselves out because the world counts us out. Stop disqualifying yourself from what Jesus is calling you to do. You're not disqualified. That's actually the opposite of the gospel. Now, the gospel does say you're unqualified, that you don't have the resume that's required to pull this off, and yet he staples his resume on top. He says, no, this is me, that you are hidden in Christ. When the Father looks at you, he sees righteousness, he sees love, he sees power, he sees strength, he sees perfection. Why? Because you are? No, because you're hidden in Christ. That as he looks at you, he sees his son, and then he calls you son, and he calls you daughter, as you're invited into a family that you and I are wildly unqualified to be a part of. And yet he says, no, but you're not disqualified. I qualified you on the cross. You are a part of what I'm doing. Your limp doesn't stop it. Your limp doesn't stop Jesus. He has work to do. And I love, there's just this funny detail at the end that I'd never really noticed before. It says, and there was plenty of grass. Like they just sat down. He's like, hey, have them sit down, and there was plenty of grass. And one of that shows the provision of what Jesus is already going to do, that there was already space for him to perform the miracle that he needed to. But what the image that came into my mind, and maybe it's just because of where I am, is I just kind of thought about our worship night the other night, where we were on the grassy plain of our new building. And I was just kind of thinking about how families were praying over families and praying over where the playground would be and what generations to come would look like as Jesus flips this world upside. Like there was something beautiful. And as I was reading this, it just kind of brought my mind to where he is leading all of us. And here's the cool part. It's 2,000 years ago when this happened. Those people sitting on that grassy plain had no idea we'd still be talking about it. Like they had no idea what he was about to do. And in the same way, I could just stand before you with confidence. This isn't about concrete and steel. This isn't about a building. This is about having a place to say, this is a foundation for our church to continue to grow and flourish in and to invite the community in. And I just want you to know that I fully believe that we're going to look back, probably not 2,000 years from now, because I'm going to be dead. But we're going to look back at some point and, man, like I couldn't believe he was going to do that. I had no idea what he was going to stir up in our community. I had no idea what he's going to do in my own life. I have full expectation that that is what he's going to do as we step forward and walk to Jesus with our limp. And not only our limp, but we look at the measly lunch that this kid brought. 2 fish, 5 loaves, both small. And Jesus says, hey, just bring what you have. Come to me with your limp. Come to me with your brokenness. Come to me with your fish and loaves and see what I am about to do. Verse 19 of Matthew, I probably should tell you what gospel we're in. I keep bouncing around. Matthew 14:19. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. I love this because here was his command at the beginning. You give them something to eat. And he carried it out. This is something that Jesus does over and over again, where he takes a kid who wasn't even counted in the head count, and he takes his small lunch, and he says, hey, I'm going to perform the miracle, but I'm going to invite you into the process. He says, hey, I'm going to do the miracle. You can't turn this bread and this fish into what it needs to be. And at the same time, I want you to pass it out. That's the whole point of our mission statement of making and sending disciples who love and live like Jesus. It's one of the reasons that Jesus needed to ascend, because if he didn't ascend, we'd just go to him. And yet he invites us into the process of disciple making. He says, go and make disciples of all nations. Because we can't do this alone. It says that the harvest is plenty, but the workers are few. He says, no, pray for the workers. Like pray that you can step out on mission, not that you do it by yourself, but that you raise other people up. That's the mission that Jesus gave. That's why he gives them the bread. And he says, you pass it out. Because he's equipping the saints to live out the mission. And all the while, that's a key function of the church. That's why we're here. We're meant to be equipped to carry the gospel wherever we are. And a lot of times when we carry it, I got to tell you, it's going to be with a limp. Now, Jesus could have done it a different way. You guys ever think about that? Like he could have just been like, boom, you got bread. Like he could have called down manna from heaven. He could have done all those different things, but that wasn't his plan. Might have been my plan, might have been the disciples' plan, but his plan was, no, I'm going to equip you to carry what needs to be carried to those who desperately need it. But here's not the promise. And this is something that I think we can get confused really easily, is that just because you bring what you can doesn't mean you get what you want. You ever struggle with that? Like I remember there's just times in my life where I look at my circumstance and I look at the storm that I'm in. I'm like, God, like I've been faithful though. Like God, like how are you allowing this in my life? And all the while he's like, no, I didn't promise you that. I promised that I'd be here. I promised that I'd be near to you. Like I didn't say you wouldn't walk through storms. In fact, that's the apologetic that I want you to navigate in that season. That's how people are going to know that I'm true, because they're going to look at your life, which is on fire, and see that your hair isn't singed. You're like, Josh, you don't have any hair. It's navigating the hard, pointing to the better. It's saying, no, like even in the storm and in the difficult. That's why when he calls us out of the boat, that's what we talked about last week, that we can step forward with boldness and ignore the wind and the waves, not because we're pretending like it's not there, just because our eyes are locked into what's better. that he is present. He is a God who wouldn't set us aside, and yet our eyes so quickly drift to the stuff. You feel that? Like drift not just to the wind and the wave. Maybe it's good stuff. We drift to the what would be called common graces, the things that we enjoy and we like. So maybe it's money, maybe it's friendship, maybe it's sex, maybe it's your marriage, maybe it's your kids, maybe it's the breadsticks at Olive Garden. Because I'm talking Alfredo sauce. That's a common grace. Stuffed mushrooms, I'm sure those are good too. I can't speak to that. I can't lie up here. But there are these common graces, and yet at the same time, we confuse the common graces and the gift for the giver. And we get our eyes so fixated on the things that we want. Listen, they're called common graces because everybody's got access to them. Believer or otherwise, you have access to common graces. Like they're able to do all those things. They could go to Olive Garden right now and get the bread that they want. They could get it. They've got access, and yet the way that we experience common graces should be very different. There's a pastor who speaks to this. I'm stealing his illustration, but we're all teaching from a book that's thousands of years old, so how new is anything? I want you to imagine you go to the center right now, and you want to go to a steakhouse. Now, I don't know what steakhouse is there, but I do know that there's something about the center that screams overly priced red meat. And so you go to the center, and you go to that place that you love, and you sit down at that restaurant, and you order a steak medium rare because you do things the way the Lord intended. I'm not laughing. And then you wait, and after a little while, you first smell it, right? The aroma reaches your nostrils. You're like, oh my goodness, this is going to be unbelievable. And then you see it, and you're like, well, man, that looks as good as it smells. And then you take a bite, and your taste buds are overwhelmed by how wonderful that taste is. And you eat it, and you're satisfied. And if you are not a believer, all of that is true. But the story, it ends there. But if you are a believer, you might take a moment to marvel. What kind of God, take a bite, what kind of God would put these flavors together in such a way that I could enjoy it? What does that say about his character, that he would spend the time to create something so good and delicious that you could enjoy it at an overly priced meal in the center? Like, as we experience the sunset, it's a reminder of the one who's painting the sky the way that it is. Like, when we look at the mountains, we're marveling over the one who pulled it up from the earth. Like, we see things differently. Yes, common graces are there. Yes, gifts are there, and yet they're all fingerprints for the King. And so when we look at that, and we marvel over it, here's the tension is so quickly our eyes fixate on the stuff and we lose sight of the one who offers it. Our eyes fixate on the gift and we forget about the giver. And yet as believers, as we limp to Jesus and as we remember, he saved me when I didn't deserve it. It's not that you checked the boxes and you made it all work, that you wooed him to you. No. He said, no, I called you to me. Like he lived the perfect life. He lived the perfect sacrifice. He sits on the throne and he did it that we could be invited into a relationship that we could never earn. All the while saying, I love you, you're chosen, accept my gift. See, this is what we get confused. But when we remember that we've got a limp, it's a lot easier to see. Here's the deal. The miracle is good, the miracle worker is better. The gift is good, the giver is better. And all the while, as he's doing these miraculous things, we're seeing a building. And yet I don't want us to get confused about the gift versus the giver. We're not pursuing a building. We're pursuing his call. I just want to be near to him. Like I want to go where he leads, and I want to step forward in boldness, knowing that he can do whatever he wants with my limp, and he can do whatever he wants with my 2 fish and 5 loaves. Like he's got it. My 5 loaves that are incredibly small. Like he's like, hey, I've got this covered. I've got a plan, and I invite you into the miracle. We have a part to play. Matthew 14, verse 20. This is awesome. They all ate and were satisfied. How many ate? Well more than 5,000. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Isn't that exactly what a God of immeasurably more would do? He takes the little they have. He says, I'm going to give you not just like a couple M&Ms, because like that's just enough for you to want the whole bag. He's like, I'm going to satisfy you. Like, I'm going to give you everything that you need. Like, you are going to be stuffed and full. You're going to be content with where you are. I'm going to give you all that. Not just that, but get the Tupperware out. Because we got 12 things we got to fill up. He gave them more than they needed. He gave them leftovers. Like, how often, like, am I at a restaurant and they're like, do you want to package the leftovers? And I'm like, no. And he's like, no. Like, bring the bread. Like, we've got things to do. Bring the bread. I'll bet you he used that bread. I don't know what he used it for, but you better believe it was used for something. He says, no, I'm a God of immeasurably more. I'll give you leftovers, but I'll also give you enough to be sustained, fulfilled, and satisfied. He's got you covered. Here's the whole point. Jesus first invites us to himself, and then he invites us into the mission. Jesus first says, hey, I want you to limp to me, and then he says, and I also want you to bring your fish and loaves. He says, hey, I'm inviting you into something bigger. Limp to me, and I will show you what I am about to do. He invites those that are counted out. He invites those who are limping. He invites those that are marginalized. He invites those that to the world have it all together, and yet they know they need something bigger than themselves. He says, I am here. Bring your limp. I don't know what your limp is. I don't know if it's pride. I don't know if it's you drink too much. I don't know if it's your relationships. I don't know if it's a resentment. I don't know what your limp is. I don't know if it's maybe money has a hold of your heart, or maybe it's that your life just feels like it's on fire and you're dwelling in that, missing out on the one who is better. Like, I don't know what your limp is, but I know every single one of us has a limp. Every single one of us has something that we are navigating right now that he is trying to work out of us and calling us to what is better. Some of us, maybe you don't have a relationship with Jesus, and that's the start. It's limp to him. Like, you don't even need to get it fixed. Don't worry about that. Just go to him. And for others, maybe you've already gone to him, and he's like, yeah, but I want you to bring your fish and your loaves and see what I do. Ours is a God of immeasurably more. Here's what that means. When we step forward in faithfulness, as our faithfulness intersects with his faithfulness, he does amazing things. Because we step forward into the call that he has for us, he's like, wait and see what I am about to do, because I'm a God of immeasurably more. He says, listen, I've got this covered. I will show you things that are amazing that you couldn't possibly expect. And that is what I hope for today, which brings us to now. See, we are in the process of raising funds for our building. And I say that knowing that it's not really for a building, it's for generations to come. It's a looking to eternity saying, God, I'm going to press into what's better. And every single one of us, here's my hope, is that you've been praying over the last month of how you can take what you can and bring it to Jesus in this. How do you take your fish and your loaves, as small as they may be? And some of you, you've got bigger loaves, and that's great. But how can we all step forward in faithfulness and sacrifice to plan for what is better as he invites us into the mission that he has? If you're here for the first time, awkward. You don't feel pressured at all. Like, we're just excited that you're with us. But if you call 180 Life Church home, like if this is the place that you're like, man, I'm growing as a disciple and I want to continue growing and I want to take ground for the mission, because that's what we want. We're not a me-centric culture here. It's not just, hey, I'm going to sit and I'm going to listen to the music and I'm not going to participate. It's I'm going to engage in the battle. If that's you, then our prayer is 101. That we would all engage, 100% step forward and say, whatever I can, here I am. That we come forward with our limp and we come forward with our fish to see what our God of immeasurably more does. And so here's what we're going to do in a moment. Hopefully you have a commitment card with you. If you don't, you can raise your hand. We will find you and we'll get one to you. But hopefully you've got that and you filled that out with your family. And what I'm going to ask you to do in a moment is in a moment we're going to go ahead and we're going to bring our commitments forward. There are buckets on these tables on each side. And you're going to bring this forward in an act of just response to what we believe God is about to do. And in that, I'm going to, before we do that, I'm going to pray. First, I'm going to have our elders come forward. I deeply believe that those who lead within the church should lead. And so we're going to have our elders come forward first, and then I will open it up to everybody else. But here's my ask, is I don't know where you are in your limping process, but I do know that you are with us. So my ask is whatever you need and whatever you can bring, let's be faithful for what we can. And and at the same time know that God is going to do immeasurably more. They had no idea those fish and those bread were going to turn into something bigger. We have no idea what he's going to do, and yet I am expectant that it will be good. Jesus, we love you. We pray boldly over this. We pray boldly over this situation that God is, that you're in it, that you are calling us forward, that we are able to step forward with a fire for you in our gut, knowing that you are good and that you call us to what is better. Help us to be a place that doesn't make sense to the rest of the world. Help us to have a church home where we can grow, where our grandkids can go and learn what it means to be a disciple. Help them to be raised up. Lord, give us the opportunity to have a church home. Take our fish, take our loaves, and do something more. If you are an elder of this church, now is your time to respond, and then I will open it up to everybody else.